What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Building Men podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dennis Meralda, joined today by a guy I just met. His name is Nick Carrier. He's a master fitness expert on goal achievement and habit formation. He runs the podcast, The Best You, and he does a 10-week program that I'm sure we'll get into during our podcast today. He's a good-looking dude, too. What's up, Nick? How's it going, man?
What's up, Dennis? Hey, man, appreciate it. Right back at you, bro.
Love the accent, too. So you said you're from you're from Tennessee.
So I live in Nashville right now. I've lived here for 5.5 years, but I'm from Atlanta originally.
Okay, but I could tell you have like the southern accent. Can you tell the nuanced differences in southern accents? Like, can you tell the difference between Atlanta, Tennessee, North Carolina?
There's definitely a little bit of definitely some nuances. So I'm from Atlanta, and in Atlanta, I don't really feel like I have an accent. I probably sound a little bit southern, maybe some people who are not around it all that much. But me, I went to college at UGA, and so there's a lot of people from all over the place in Georgia, and so we
Yeah,
get some really southern kids, and so there are some real accents that I get to hear. So I feel like I'm a northerner compared to them.
that's pretty funny. And then people
Yeah.
tell me they sound like, yo, I'm straight out of New York. At times, a couple of the things that I say, and I'm right in the middle of New York City and Philadelphia, where I'm in Central Jersey. So a bulldog. You're a Georgia alum. What number Uggo was the bulldog when you were down there? Do you remember?
I have no idea. I'm a big football fan, but I don't know like the ins and outs of how many Uggas were on.
Right. Oh, it's
Yeah.
hysterical. And I mean, now they were always like a team that was right on the periphery of winning it. I mean, Alabama, LSU, they were powerhouses back in the day. But just recently, like Georgia's like you got some pride there with what's going on with that football team now.
Oh man, it's been great. The 4 years that I were there, we were always mediocre and never. We always had hope, but
Yeah.
we never ended up winning the big games. And so now it's been super fun the last couple of years being back to back champs, baby.
And they're just kicking ass right now.
Yeah, it's back to back champs is something that's only been done like 3 times now, and so it's been pretty cool to watch.
Absolutely. Do you get any like now that you're in Tennessee? Because obviously the Vols are that's a big rivalry right there. You get a lot of shit from from people in Tennessee.
Yeah, the Tennessee Vols are like everybody loves the Tennessee Vols here,
Yeah.
which is cool. They're honestly a great fan base, and they're a huge rival of ours. But I like watching Vols games. They're very spirited fans, and so I make sure to respect that and not run my mouth if we're playing them and whooping their butt. It's just kind of like one of those things, you whip their butt. You don't need to rub it in their face
Yep.
any more than just the playing field.
Yeah, you just kind of smile, smirk a little bit. Who was Georgia's biggest rivalry when you were there?
Georgia's biggest rivalry every year is typically Florida. We play Florida every year, Auburn every year. Those are big rivals. Georgia Tech is a rival, but they're not haven't been very
Right.
good as of late. And then Tennessee. So it's kind of like Tennessee, Florida, and Auburn are our biggest three rivals. And depending on the year, some of those teams are really good, some of those teams are not as good. So it just kind of depends on the year, I guess I would say.
So growing up in Atlanta, did you always want to go to University of Georgia? Was that always a thing from when you were little?
I actually didn't. My mom went to University of Florida for a couple of years,
Oh
and so I
boy,
actually
okay.
kind of grew up as a Florida fan. My dad went to Colorado, so they were never really a football school or a team to really cheer for. And college football was big in the Southeast, and so all my friends were Georgia fans. But I had latched on a team, and luckily I latched on to Florida when they were super good and had Tebow and won a couple
Right.
national championships. So I've had a pretty good run as a college football fan.
Really, for real, dude.
Yeah.
And University of Colorado, it's funny. I was just telling my son, this will be before your time, but so I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And those if you're a parent and you're listening right now and you're around my age, mid 40s ish, there were these starter, the brand starter had these starter jackets. And there was a thing where, you wanted a starter jacket if you didn't have your team. So I was a Yankees fan, a Giants fan, a Knicks fan. You would get a team that nobody else had. So it was like this nuanced thing where you wanted a starter jacket that nobody else had. And the one that I found that no one else in my school had was the Colorado Buffaloes.
Oh.
And so I wore a Colorado Buffalo starter jacket when I was in high school for years. And I remember, I think it was Cordell Stewart he was the man out there. He was a quarterback and they called him
Yeah.
Slash, right? When he went into the pros, he played for the Steelers, I believe.
Yeah, no, they were really good back in the day. I think it was 1980 when they shared a national championship, maybe, or not 80 because that was when Georgia won a national championship. Maybe 1990, but they won a national championship one year. But yeah, my dad went there, my brother went there. We've been out to Boulder all the
All right.
time, and so yeah, we love
So you
it.
have a lot of like big time football in your family's blood. Did you play a lot of sports when you were growing up?
Yeah, I played all the sports growing up, and then in high school, I committed to football and baseball throughout all of high school. So yeah, those are my two sports.
So let's go back to learning about Nick as a middle and a high school student. I mentioned building men. What we're trying to do is help young men become the best versions of themselves. Like we're building men of character, integrity, strength, compassion, empathy. Like that's our mission here, right? So I love to learn about our guest experience in middle school. One of the reasons why I got into education, I started building men was I just had a horrific middle school experience. I just remember looking back, it was really challenging for me. What were your memories? Do you have good memories overall of middle and high school, or did you have a challenging experience?
Yeah, man, I've been pretty fortunate. I've always had really great school experiences from early elementary school to middle school. I went to the same school, and then high school from seventh grade to 12th grade. I went to the same school, and I grew up Catholic, and I went to a private Catholic school my entire life and had great experiences, had great friends, great teachers, and I always played sports and had awesome coaches. And no doubt that my parents, teachers, and coaches are what truly laid such a great foundation for me growing up. I actually just made a post about it yesterday about I think a lot of what I do as a fitness trainer is helping people build self-confidence. And I've always been somebody who's had a pretty good level of self-confidence. Obviously, it wavers from now and then depending on the time, but I always have a pretty good solid foundation of self-confidence. And I've asked myself a number of times, why is that? Where does
Yeah.
that come from? And I realized that at a young age, one of the biggest things that provided me with self-confidence is the people around me speaking their belief in me to me. And so I had parents, I had teachers, I had coaches who were great leaders and would speak their belief into me. They would say I was, great at whatever it is that I might be great at, or encourage me that I could do better, and really believe in me. And so I think at a young age, it's hard to necessarily build self-confidence on your own if you're not being taught what that needs to look like, or you're not being encouraged or believed upon by other people. And so I really think that my foundational self-confidence came from the amazing parents, teachers that I had, or teachers and coaches that I had. And then no doubt my parents like filled me with belief, filled me with encouragement, filled me with confidence. I actually just texted my dad the other day, like, thank you so much for being the father who spoke belief into me and encouraged me on a regular basis. Because as I grow older and have more conversations with people and learn from more people, the more I realize that that is really rare. And I think I took it for granted when I was growing up.
100% it's rare. A lot of the guys that I speak to on the podcast had the antithesis of that upbringing, that they needed to fall down many times and they were challenged with different things that life was throwing at them because they didn't have that strong male role model in their life. Nick, I got to tell you that the message that you sent to your dad about like, hey, thank you so much for who you were. That's worth more to a father than any like tangible present you could ever give. That one, it could be a text message, it could be a phone call, it could be an in-person thing. So those of you listening out there, if you have an opportunity to reach out, if you have that person in your life, don't miss those opportunities. It's so important to do that. And Nick, you mentioned self-confidence. I wanted to get into this, so I'm glad you started the conversation off. You mentioned with the idea of self-confidence, you had people that were speaking belief in you to you. And that's an interesting way to think about self-confidence. A lot of the kids that I work with will struggle with confidence. And I don't consider myself like a quote unquote confidence coach, but I do work on helping young men understand how to be confident in themselves. So that's one way to do it, right? Is so with the adults in your life, like truly believing you and speaking those words of validation, helping them go. And I end every podcast, you'll see, is go one step further than you thought you could go. That's my tagline to end the podcast. So say you're a kid that's listening and you don't have those people in your life that are speaking the belief in you to you. How do you go about developing that level of self-confidence then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to address it in a second, but I'm just going to touch on the fact that I sent my dad that text. And that's something that I've tried to get better at, because we have these thoughts and we have these appreciations and we have these senses of gratitude and thankfulness in our heads. But I feel like very rarely we end up expressing it to the person that we're actually appreciative and thankful for. And so it doesn't take that much to do it, right? It just takes a few minutes of taking out your phone and being sincere. And, as a man, sometimes you're not as sincere and you feel weird stating that kind of appreciation to another man, but it's really important. But when it comes to building self-confidence without other people speaking specific belief into you, I can only really speak from my experience. And I know that the second thing that really built up my self-confidence is simply my work ethic, and seeing how my work ethic led to improved results, improved relationships, and things like that in my life. Because I was really thinking actually a lot about it yesterday as to what is self-confidence, what is self-confidence. And I think that there's a few different pieces of it, but I think one piece of self-confidence is you having the feeling that you can, to a certain degree, control and dictate the outcomes and the results that you want in life. I think that if you have confidence, you feel like you can make happen what you want to make happen. You can get to where you want to be. You can become the person that you want to become. And so I think for me, what built self-confidence at a really young age was me seeing that my work ethic in school and me studying really hard and paying attention in class led to me getting good grades in school. And I saw that when I practiced really hard in baseball, when I practiced really hard in football, it would lead to better results on the playing field. And so when I could tie the process and work ethic and execution and follow through of the process to like, oh, this stuff is actually working. This stuff can bring me some of the desired results that I actually want. And I made that connection. It's like, oh, I can tie that thing to any other area of my life that I want to get better results in. And so if I can transfer that work ethic, then I'm going to be able to become the person that I wish to become. And so I think that's a huge thing. And then the next thing about with self-confidence, I think is really key. I said that being able to tie your work ethic to the results is a big self-confidence builder, but it's not necessarily all about the results because you can't really control the results. I tie my self-confidence as to being the type of person who follows through with the promises that I make to myself. I put my self-confidence in the type of person that I am. And I have the belief that I'm a person of integrity, meaning I'm a person of alignment, meaning I'm the person who says they're going to do something and they actually do it. You see, there's a difference between honesty and integrity. Honesty is when your words match reality, but integrity is when your reality matches your words. Again, when you say you're going to do something and then you actually do it. And when you have that reputation with yourself, that you see yourself repeatedly over time saying that you're going to do something and actually doing it, then it's like that builds all the self-confidence that I need. And so I think that's a massive part. And then lastly, placing my self-confidence in my intentions as a person, in my intentions as a man, because this is a recent thing that I started to learn and tie my self-confidence to, because sometimes as a fitness trainer or somebody who provides health and fitness advice to other people, I can get the imposter syndrome. And I can think like, who am I the best person to be coaching this person? Am I the best person to be giving this person advice? And there's obviously probably plenty of people out there who are going to be better at giving certain pieces of advice than I am, but I have confidence in my intentions that I am working as hard as I possibly can to help that person become the person they want to become. I am working as hard as I can. I have the strong intentions and the good-willed intentions to serve that person to my utmost ability. And so trying to tie my confidence to my intentions and my follow-through is massive for me rather than simply just on the result itself.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a well thought out explanation of it, Nick. And what do you say to the people then that are the fake it till you make it crowd? Like, what's your response to them?
Yeah, I've always had a weird relationship with that phrase. I think it depends on how you apply it. I think that fake it till you make it is not the right way to apply it if you're not somebody who's willing to step into humility, because I think sometimes people use the phrase fake it till you make it practically and they don't ask questions and they're not curious and they're not willing to admit to somebody else that they don't have the answers. However, I think if you use fake it till you make it in the sense of like, I might not feel ready to take on this risk, but I'm going to go for it anyway. And I'm going to figure it out along the way, then fake it till you make it's the right application. And so I think fake it till you make it, again, in summary, is don't be the person who's not willing to ask questions and who's not willing to step into humility and fake it like that. Be the person who's willing to take on risks, even though you don't have all the answers right now. So you're not really faking it. You're kind of just going as a lesser version of yourself than you necessarily feel like you should be, but then be willing to become the version of yourself that you need to be by asking questions along the way.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it was something that I often struggled with. I've heard that phrase so many times in my life, and it's like you have to have the belief in yourself, right? And then like once you have even a little sprinkle of the belief, then you just have to go. You have to start walking, start the journey, and as you do, you start collecting these little wins, and then the confidence starts building from that point, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm a guy who in his early to mid 40s reinvented myself, right? So I left public education, I started doing what I'm doing, but also during the COVID time frame, I developed a ton of bad habits. I was eating like crap. I was drinking almost every single day. I developed a really bad, it was like these daily things that I was doing weren't serving me at all. And I was a mess. I'm 6'4", but I was like 255, and it wasn't a middle linebacker for Georgia 255. It was, like it was a soft, gushy 255. So I started, and without any confidence in what I was going to do, I just started. I'm like, all right, I need to make some changes here. I'm gonna start moving, start doing certain things. And for me, what changed was my daily habits. And so there's certain things that I started to put into place. And I just started to do those things every single day. And for me, the first thing was just drinking like a gallon of water, a little bit more than a gallon of water every single day. And I'm like, I can do this every single day. So let me just start here. Then it was movement. And then there was like several things that I started to stack on and on. And over the course of like 3 or 4 months, I wound up dropping like 40 pounds. And that just became who I was. But the reason why I'm asking you that is just the idea of habit formation. So it's part of how you describe what you're doing and who you are. So first and foremost, because I want to spend a little time talking about habits, how, like, someone comes to you and they're a mess. They're struggling with their mental health, with their physical fitness. What's the first thing that you talk to them about with habits? You have them go through a checklist, or are you like, no, we start here no matter what, or is it more differentiated based on the person?
Yeah, good question. First off, congrats on making the changes in your life and losing the weight that you needed to lose, and like taking it bit by bit and step by step, and focusing on water first, and then doing something else, and then doing something else, and then adding something a little bit here. Like that is ultimately the way that we need to go about changing our lives and changing our habits. And so the first thing that I do is I can't remember if it was the former or the latter, but it's definitely a person by person scenario. And so I kind of ask everybody just where they currently are with their fitness habits, if any, where they currently are with their nutritional habits, if any, and then maybe talking about water, maybe talking about sleep and stuff like that. But I usually talk about fitness and nutrition first, because ultimately the people that I work with are going to be people who are working out with me at least 2 times a week. And so I need to get a certain idea of where they're at with regards to their fitness, regards to their fitness. And then usually when I'm working with people, nutrition wise, at some point in their life, if they're not focused on their nutrition all that much right now, at some point in their life, they have been focused on it. And so they have an idea of what eating healthier actually looks like. And then I usually try to work on both at the same time. And I always think that one of the most important things to do when it comes to trying to form habits that stick is make them what I call workable. And so, we always have, I like to tell a story that when I first tried to start reading more right out of college, I was a person who just never did summer reading. Sorry, you were a principal. I hated summer reading.
So did I. I hated it too.
I don't think I read a book cover to cover until I graduated college.
Right.
And then I started to get really into personal development, and everybody was talking about how you got to read books. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I got to start reading now. And so I started to try to do this. And, I watched a video and I got really motivated. I got really excited. I was like, all right, I'm going to start reading an hour a day for 5 times a week. I'm going to start doing it. And I probably read for 1 hour a day that first time. And I was probably about to shoot myself because I was just so bored of reading. And then I was like, okay, something's got to change here. And so I dialed it back to 20 minutes a day, 5 times a week. Now, I wasn't perfect at doing that, but I was a whole hell of a lot better dialing it back to 20 minutes compared to an hour. Why is that? Because it was more workable for me. And so I think the best predictor of what we're going to be willing and able to do tomorrow is what we were willing and able to today. And so oftentimes when we get really high on our motivation, we're like, all right, we're going to read for an hour a day. We're going to work out for an hour every single day. We're going to make sure we cut out all sugar. We're going to cut out all alcohol. We're going to do 2 workouts a day every single day. Like, we're going to do these insane things because we're really motivated right now. But then the problem is, a few days later, a few weeks later, a few months later, there's no chance you're going to have that same level of motivation. And so you kind of have this tainted perception of what you're going to be willing and able to do moving forward, simply because your high level of motivation in your current state. And so it's important to take an honest assessment of saying, okay, I'm going to pick something, or I'm going to pick an amount of that thing that's workable, meaning it's the thing or an amount that I'm willing and able to do based off of what I've been willing and able to do in the past. And so if you, for example, you weren't maybe all that willing to eat well and exercise a lot and drink water, but like, I can drink water and I'm going to try a gallon a day. And so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to nail it every single day for a while. And then you're like, oh, okay, now I can do this. Now I can add something else in. What becomes workable is actually bigger as you go across time. And so I always try to feel out for people, okay, fitness wise, have you been working out 2 times a week? Have you been working out 0 times a week? Have you been working out 4 times a week? Okay, how can we maybe do just a little bit more? How can we optimize that just a little bit? And then let's do that for maybe 4 or 5 weeks or so, and prove to yourself that you're the type of person who's willing and able to do that. And then let's build on it. And then same thing with nutrition side of things. I always ask people with the nutrition side of things is, where's your current biggest pain point? And usually it's a meal for somebody. Usually it's my breakfast is always terrible, or it's my lunch is like, I always eat lunch at work and I always go out and I'm not really focused on it. When I go home for dinner, maybe it's pretty good, or maybe it's the other way around. It's I'm good at lunch, but my dinner is always crap. I always overeat. Or some people, it might be eating after dinner and having sweets. Some people, it might be snacking, but it's like, all right, let's try to pick a meal that is your biggest pain point. Let's focus on that meal for the next 4 or 5 weeks. Or let's focus on the sweets or the snacking, whatever it is. So it's trying to like identify the biggest pain point, the biggest leverage point that you can start acting upon and making it workable, making it an amount that you'd be willing and able to do based off of what you've been willing and able to do in the past.
I appreciate that. And it made me think of, you're mentioning pain point. When I work with people, we can get into goals and achievements in a little bit too, but when I work with people, that like that's the thing that comes up. Typically when there's that pain point, it's not just, well, it's the middle of the day and I like sweets. There's something that's underlying. So I look at helping people achieve their goals, and I look at it like an equilateral triangle, right? So there's the top of the triangle is your target, what you're aiming for. The bottom, say left, is the plan, and the plan I look at as like 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. So it can't just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to bench 315 pounds. That is my goal that I set for myself. I can't go tomorrow and put 3 plates on each side and get going with it. Like, I had to go to the gym this morning, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna start off at 135, 185, 225, and I'll get up to like 265, and I could do 2 reps at 265. All right, that's good. Then I could build on that for the next time. If I tried 315 today, I wouldn't be talking to you right now because the weights would have been on my esophagus or my larynx or whatever. So it's like steadily doing it. But the biggest piece of that equilateral triangle for goal is the identity piece, in my opinion. You need to believe that you are the type of person that can achieve whatever this goal is, right? So the belief in yourself is the key part. And when someone has a pain point, how do you go about helping them weave through that pain or uncover it or tackle it? Because if they don't do that, they might lose the weight and keep it off for 30 days, 90 days, whatever it is. But once that pain point comes back in, they're going to be back to eating, marshmallows and whatever at 3 a.m.
Yeah, dude, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because that is the probably most important thing to make habits lasting over time, is to make sure that you're tying your identity to those habits. And so I kind of look at yourself, the way I communicate this to my clients and people that I work with is I talk about, okay, your self-identity is massive. are going to never consistently live greater than how you view yourself. And there's a great Zig Ziglar quote that I would butcher if I tried to do it, but it's like, you are never going to consistently behave in a manner that is inconsistent with how you see yourself. And so I talk with people, okay, your self-identity is how you view yourself. How can you, and that's largely going to determine the actions and the habits that you live out. So how can we make sure that we try to improve or upgrade or transform our self-identity? I think the first thing is how you talk about yourself to yourself. And usually that ends up leading into the second thing, is how you talk about yourself to other people. And so there are so many people who I work with who will say, God, I just always struggle on the weekends. I had a lady who said, my husband's going out of town this weekend, and I can't eat healthy when he's gone, or I can't wake up in the morning. And when you say things like, I've always been this person, or I am always been this way, or I'm just trying to do this, it's like, no, you've not made the decision that you're going to change yet. And so I call people out when they're communicating to our group of, no, you're not trying to do this thing. You're going to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, you've always been that person who maybe struggled when your husband went out of town, but that was just you in the past. That's not going to be you now. You're a completely different person now. And so making sure that we transform our self-identity, I think, really begins with changing the verbiage and the communication that you have about yourself to yourself and others. And so people most often underestimate the power of their words as it relates to their habits that they live out. But it is so, so, so massive. Like, be careful of the words and be careful of the things that you speak out that you end up living into. And then the next part of building your self-identity, I think, is your self-identity is based off of what you see yourself repeatedly doing. If you see yourself repeatedly working out week after week, month after month, year after year, then you're going to see yourself as the type of person who just works out. If you are cooking for yourself and meal prepping for yourself, you're going to see yourself as the type of person who just meal preps. And so that's why setting workable goals is absolutely massive, because if your goal is way too big in the beginning, then sure, you'll do something for a short period of time, but then you probably won't be able to sustain it. And then you hadn't repeatedly done anything. Therefore, you never had the opportunity to transform your identity, because transforming your identity only comes from repeatedly seeing yourself repeatedly do things over time. So you need to give yourself the opportunity to repeatedly do these things across time. And so I'm really glad that you brought up the self-identity thing, because it is one of the toughest things for people to break out of. And one of the flaws of a 10-week transformation is oftentimes people go into it thinking, okay, this is the version of Dennis that it was in the middle of a 10-week transformation. But man, when it's done, I can't wait for it to be done, because then I won't have to continue this stuff.
Right.
And so people, anytime there's like a timeline to something, people can create two versions of themselves. The version of themselves that is participating in the program, and then the version of themselves that is before and after the program. And so we need to realize that just because something is a timelined program or thing that you're doing, you should be going in with the intent that whatever it is that you're forming during should be what you're trying to stick with after. And so that's what I try to communicate to my people. I like to remind them on a regular basis. I know this is a 10-week transformation, but y'all, I am trying to help you for 10 weeks and beyond. Let's not go into this thing having this limited mindset that this is the version of me in the program and there's a different version of me out. They're all the same person.
I love that. It's funny. I just jotted down what I did. Oh, how long ago was this? This has got to be, it's more than 15 years ago. And it was before there was like a digital version. I went out and I bought the DVDs for P90X. So it was Tony Horton that did P90X. It was like beachbody.com or whatever. And it was like 12 DVDs and they had the whole thing, but it was like 90 days for this transformation. And I did it a couple times, but I had the thought even back then about, all right, well, I can get through this for 90 days. I didn't have the mindset of, no, this is just who I am. This is the lifestyle. This is, a finite period of time that I will do these things, but it's more about who I am in the long run. And the other thing that was interesting to me, Nick, was my work with students now with kids in schools. I do a program called from what's your problem to what's your story. And I want kids to understand the idea of like, we all, we've heard that so many times in our life, like, what's your problem, what's his problem, what's her problem. And if we could shift our thought process a little bit to what's our story, we all have these different stories that we go through. And so one of the things I tell the kids, I show them the two different words. The first word I show them is abracadabra. And I say, what is this? When you see this, what does it mean to you? And they're all like, magic, and or Harry Potter or whatever, and the literal translation from ancient Aramaic, and this comes from a guy that I had on the podcast that actually went through his coaching program. His name is Mark England, did a TEDx talk around this idea. Abracadabra literally translated means with my words I create. So when you think about magic and the importance of our words, like, that's what it actually means. And the word spell means a word or group of words with great power or influence. So we have the ability to absolutely change our lives with the words we use when we speak to ourselves. It's a really, it's a simple yet the most complex concept there is in the world, that idea, like how much we can do that. So when you're working with someone, and they don't have that belief in themselves, right? And so the confidence is built by someone speaking the belief into them. Is that what you do with your own clients? Are you like, I will be the magician, I will speak those words to you until you believe them for yourself?
Yeah, to a certain degree, I believe that's a little bit of what I do. I don't necessarily think of it like that, but I do believe that oftentimes, if you don't have confidence or belief in yourself, you need to borrow it from somebody else for a certain period of time until you have seen yourself repeatedly do the thing. Because I think that is, to an extent, how you can start to believe the words that you're saying about yourself, is when you've seen the actions and the habits sustain themselves across time. And so somebody who's joining a program with me for the first time, I might try to get their verbiage and their communication about themselves to themselves to change early on. And they might start doing it, but they might not start really believing it. And they might not really start adopting that new identity until they've done 20 weeks in a row with me. And then they are completely changed. And then maybe they really start to believe in it. And then they really believe in themselves and their ability to follow through. And so, to kind of go back on the confidence thing, I always tell people with our 10 weeks is, you have a goal at the end of this 10 weeks that we're setting, and I'm going to work like hell myself to get you to that goal. However, success in this program is not just based on that goal. It's about becoming the person who follows through with the promises that you make to yourself, because that's what you can control. And I really believe that is how your identity changes. When you see yourself as that person of integrity, when you see yourself as that person of discipline, when you see yourself as the person who knows and identifies the hard thing that you need to do, and then you actually do it. And so, yeah, man, I think that borrowing the belief in the beginning is important for a lot of people to hopefully sustain them through the peaks and the valleys. But then at a certain point, I do see people visually in front of my eyes start to really believe it themselves. And that's when it's so cool to see. Like, I messaged a client of mine yesterday, who's in her middle of her fourth straight 10-week program with me. So she's 35 weeks in, and she came into the class yesterday yesterday morning and said something, and I was like, texted her later, I was like, I would have never heard that come out of your mouth 25 weeks ago. Like, that was awesome for you to hear, and that was awesome for you to think the way that you thought. And so, yeah, man, it's great to be able to see people finally across time believe the new identity that they're verbalizing to themselves.
I love that. And when you're a coach at heart, when some of your best moments in your life is watching other people find that level of belief in themselves. Like, I think about some of my favorite moments there as a coach or as a father, seeing my kids or kids that I'm coaching or working with, like, do something that they thought was impossible, and then they were able to overcome whatever dragon was in front of them. It's like a feeling that I get the chills right now, even thinking about a couple of those moments.
Yeah.
So Nick, when you're working with people, I'm sure you deal with a lot of, well, I saw this on TikTok, and I read, I watched Richard Simmons and sweat into the oldies, all these, like, what are certain things that you have seen have been common, misconceptions or things that people think are capital T truths that you're like, that's not the way it is right now? What are a couple examples of that?
Yeah, I think I'm lucky to where I think that a lot of the people that I work with luckily have caught up and don't have as many of those misconceptions. However, there's always the people who have the misconceptions of like, if I want to lose weight, I just have to run. I just have to do cardio and just cardio and just cardio and then just cardio.
Yeah.
And then there's people who are like, okay, I'm going to make sure I'm going to start cutting out, or I'm going to cut out red meat when I do this program. I'm like, okay, well, you're a little bit behind the times when it comes to that information. And so there's a lot of different things like that I have to speak to people from where my level of education is around those things, because most people are not regularly updating their knowledge and their education on these sorts of topics like I am. And so I would say those are maybe a couple of the biggest ones right off the bat that I see the most. And yeah, but other than that, I usually am pretty fortunate that I work with people who buy into the process that I run and trust the philosophies that I have.
So what does it look like to work with you? Are you doing in-person things? Are you doing like virtual things? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I have in-person groups in Nashville that I work with, and I work with people virtually as well. So in Nashville, I have 4 different groups that meet me 3 times a week right now. And they're small groups, anywhere from 8 to 20 people. And each of those groups, I've got 54 people that I'm currently working with across those 4. And every single person prior to the 10 weeks, they go through a 5-step process that I have laid out for them. And they start with identifying their why behind their health and fitness. Step 2 is they set their specific goal, what I call is their success indicator. Then they identify what I call their progress indicators. And those are 2 to 3 weekly goals that they got to hit. Then 4th is they plan what I call is their pills. And so pills is an acronym, PILS. It stands for the purpose of them is to increase the likelihood that you're successful. And then lastly, everybody sets up a scoreboard. And so they kind of put all those different components onto a scoreboard to provide them with a good reminder on a regular basis, provides them with feedback, and it provides them with motivation when they see themselves making progress.
I love that. And I there's something to acronyms when you're working with people. There's just something about that it helps it stick in our brains in the area of our brain that it needs to be. So you also have behind you, there's the sign for Best You. That's the podcast that you run. So give us a little bit of information about why did you decide to start that podcast, and what is it like? Give us a little bit about if we were to jump over and listen to it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So yeah, I started the podcast back in October of 2018. So about 4.5 years ago now. And when I graduated from college, I started to get really into self-improvement and listening to podcasts for the first time, really back in 2013, and watching YouTube videos and reading books finally. And the first podcast that I really started listening to was Lewis Howes's The School of Greatness.
Mm-hmm.
And just got really into listening to his podcast. I was driving a lot at the time, so I had a ton of listen to it. And so I got his book called The Mask of Masculinity. And I ended up reading a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote in that book that's actually typed out on that little picture frame right there. And it's, every man is in some way my superior, and in that I can learn of him. And when I read that quote in his book, for whatever reason, it just struck me and hit me really hard. And it was one of those few moments, probably one of the, maybe the only moment of my life, where I just kind of had this put the book down, sit there kind of a moment. And I was like, I'm going to start the podcast. I think I maybe had the idea in my head beforehand of doing a podcast. And that was probably just the catalyst of like, okay, let's go. Because I've had this idea of my personal why is I just want to get closer to the best version of myself. But I hated that was my why when I was coming up with that, because I just feel like that's such a cliche. Like everybody says, get closer to the best version of yourself. But then I realized the reason why I didn't like coming back to that was because a lot of people tell you to get closer to the best version of yourself, but a lot of people don't define actually how. And so when I came up with the realization of like, oh, I want to figure out how, like if I come up with a process, I want to come up with a framework that helps people get closer to the best version of themselves. And I need to make sure that I surround myself and ask the people who I believe up to this point in their life have done an amazing job of doing that, and pick their brain and ask them how they did it. And so I believe that there's kind of 6 different areas of our life: our health, personal, career, financial, spiritual, and relational. And so I believe that we need to work in all 6 areas continually across our lifespan in order to maximally go on the journey of getting closer to the best version of ourselves. And so I bring that up because on our podcast, I try to hit people from all 6 areas. I try to hit people experts in health. Obviously, it's a decent amount of health focus. It's a lot personal development focused, business leaders, entrepreneurs, athletes, radio personalities, different things like that. And then definitely some relationship experts, some spiritual experts, and things of that nature as well. So I always usually talk with people about how they've gotten to where they currently are in their life and getting their story for usually the first half of the episodes. And then after that, it's kind of like, okay, what are you working on now? Like, what's your current piece of work and how is that helping people help them get closer to the best version of themselves?
I like that. And you mentioned Lewis House School of Greatness. It was one of the podcasts that I was listening to as I was going through my own transformation. And having that book that resonates with you that's a big part of it, right? There's always that. I mean, when we're growing up, there's the athlete that we're watching, there's the band that we listen to, but then there's also that like that one thing that got you going, that got you a little bit over the hump. There was a poem for me. The poem is called "The Man in the Glass." That was the initial thing that got me going. It was about like being able to look at yourself in the mirror, more about integrity. And the other one was a poem called "If" by Rudyard Kipling. Two really powerful poems. If you were to say you would recommend a book to a kid that's in high school right now, he might not be the kid that's reading an hour a day. He's more the kid that it's like 10, 20 minutes a day. What book would you recommend?
Oh man, that's a good one because I'm right now the kind of, because I don't think I would recommend all the books that I read right now. I think it's a bigger book, but it's pretty easy to read and I think it's pretty relatable for everybody. And so it can be pretty impactful for somebody who's of that age as well. I think The 7 Habits of Highly Effective
Yeah.
People by Stephen Covey. Again, it's a big book, but I think that it's very simply communicated, but yet profound. And that was one of many of the first books that I read. And then, oh man, I should know this book off the top of my head because it was massive for me too. It was actually the first book that I started to read or that I read from cover to cover. I'm blanking on the name right now. Hopefully I'll come back to it, but I'll try to recommend that at the end if I can come up with it.
Yeah, no worries, man. And that's a thing. And even now, like I asked that question, okay, what would you recommend for a young man? But I'm taking down notes for myself as well. I'm always trying to have something that I'm reading the hard copy of it, and then also something that I'm listening to on Audible. And it's just understanding that like the quote that you mentioned as well, like every single person out there, going back, tying in the idea of the story, every single person out there has a story. I was talking to a guy in town where I live. He's from Costa Rica and he just opened up a coffee store, a coffee shop. Makes great coffee, the pour over coffee, and he calls it turtle bean. And it's because he wants you to go and like slow down and have a conversation. Coffee shouldn't be drive through out of a styrofoam cup. He's like, you need to enjoy this process. You know, it takes a little while for it to, as you're brewing the coffee or whatever. But he has this whole theory around it. And he said, as human beings, we're just in the fast lane so much. You know, we're so used to doing that. And he tells a story that he was working overseas for some, in high school. He was, again, he was from another country. He was doing something for a foreign diplomat. He was working in some capacity. And he said, I was so anxious to get onto the next thing. And I'm at this big event. And he didn't even recognize it. He's just sitting down having a conversation. The woman sitting next to him was like the head of state from some other country. And she was like this fascinating woman that he had no idea she was sitting next to him, but he didn't think to take the time to turn around and invest just a minute in her, 2 minutes in her. And he said it could have been a game changer for him. And then she goes out and she gives the keynote speech on stage. And he's like, I'm such an idiot. I was just sitting next to this woman. So he came up with this whole idea of just like settling down, because every person that you encounter, they have that story. They have that something that they've done in their life could potentially impact you. And if not you, someone that you're working with. So give me an
That's great.
example of that. Like in your life, have you ever had a situation where it might have been otherwise considered a throwaway moment, but you had that conversation, like the poem that you just mentioned, that someone out there impacted you on a deep, profound level that you had no idea was going to happen?
Yeah, if I really had the time to think about it, I'd be able to come up with, I'm sure, a very profound one. Actually, I can probably come up with two. And so the first one is not necessarily an exact example of kind of what you're talking about. The second one is a little bit more of that. So the first one, when I was in college, I studied finance and insurance when I was in college. That was my major. And I got my personal trainer certification though when I was in college. And there was, when I was driving one day, an orange tent in a parking lot that said Orange Theory Fitness on it. And I had no idea what that was at the time. And I told myself when I was driving around, maybe I'll just go by there and check it out one day to see what it is. And I remember one Friday I was driving around, I was literally a little hungover and getting ready to go to the gym. And I was like passing the tent and I was like, maybe I'll just go in there and talk to them now, see what's going on. And talk to them. It was the owner of a studio that was getting ready to be opened. And he actually lived in Atlanta. He was from Atlanta, right from my area. So he knew where I went to school, had some mutual connections. And we hit it off and talked for probably 30 minutes. And he was getting ready to open a studio. At the time, it was in November and they were going to be opening in January. And he was like, why don't you come to Atlanta over Christmas break and try out a class and see if you're interested in becoming a coach? And I was like, okay. Long story short, went, tried a class, became a coach at Orange Theory Fitness my junior year of college. And I did it for 7 years thereafter. Wow. And that was the thing that essentially got me into health and fitness and completely changing my career. So that to me was a great example of such a small little interaction that I had no idea the impact that it was going to make in my life. And then one quick other one is I went to a breakfast a few years ago with somebody who invited me. It was kind of like one of these charity breakfasts. And I went and I ended up speaking to the organizer at the event of that morning. And there was a motivational speaker at the event. And the motivational speaker's name was Scott Hamilton. And I had no idea who this guy was at the time. And his speech was so good. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I emailed the organizer of the event afterwards, like, hey, I'm actually starting this podcast. The speaker was awesome. Would you mind connecting me with him? And the speaker was Scott Hamilton, the Olympic gold medalist figure skater. And I essentially got him on the podcast. He was my third podcast episode. And then his agent then connected me to somebody else who I had on my podcast. That guy is now one of my biggest mentors. That guy also connected me with a number of other people that have had profound impacts on my life as well. And so, like you said, you can never underestimate what the power of just a conversation might have on your life. And so, to me, the biggest practical thing moving from that is just have conversations with people. Don't be quiet. Don't sit in your corner. Get out on the playing field and take action and go and meet people and make sure your interactions with them are you being curious about them.
Go into the conversations to listen and then to give of yourself, not try to take something from another person, right? Nick, this has been an awesome experience getting to know you, talking to you, hearing about your story and your journey. Before I give you an opportunity to share where we can find you and check out all your stuff, if I'm listening to this episode right now and I've already got a lot of value with the pieces of advice that you've given, the words of wisdom, if I could do one thing when I shut this podcast off right now, and doing that one thing can totally change where my life is going, what can I do right now? What's that one thing?
Set a meaningful goal for yourself and start following through. And keep it somewhere that you can manage. Find an area of your life that you can start winning in and start building some momentum. Start building some momentum so that you can stack wins just like you did. Like you are such a perfect example of starting where you can and then stacking wins and optimizing after that. Like you have to form a habit before you can optimize it. So find some place that you can start winning in and start going and make sure it's down a meaningful path, because a meaningful path is what also provides it with sustainability as well. If you just kind of start going down something that's really not all that meaningful for you, then you're not going to keep going. And so set a meaningful goal and start following through on the minute things and executing on the minute things, on the small things, and start stacking wins on top of that. And you're going to see momentum going, and you're going to see the trajectory of that area of your life change and the other areas of your life change as well.
Love it. Great piece of advice. If you do that, follow through with that, and then you start expanding on that. I mean, that's how your life can absolutely change. So Nick, where do we find you? How do we get in touch with you?
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. The best place where I'm at all the time is Instagram. I'm carrier_bestyou. And then I've got my website, nickcarrier.com. And as you mentioned, we've got the Best You podcast as well, where we drop 2 episodes every single week, an interview episode with an amazing guest, and then a separate solo episode from me. That's what we call our 10 WT tips episode. So that's a lot more health, fitness, and goal setting oriented.
Awesome. Thank you, man. I really, really appreciate that. As if you got value from this episode, go check out everything that Nick is doing, and then share this podcast with someone else that you might get that might get benefit from what you've heard here. Check out Nick's Best You. Check out his website. Check out his Instagram. I just followed along with you. We have a couple people in common already that we'll shoot the shit about afterwards. For the Building Men audience, go one step further than you thought you could go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.